March 15, 1887. They say the last thing Richard Calhoun III ever saw was Grace's eyes burning like coals in the darkness of his mansion parlor. By morning, he was blind forever. By the end of the week, so were his 3 sons. They don't want you to know what happened in that room, but I found the records they tried to burn. This isn't just about one family losing their sight. This is about a dynasty that built their fortune on blood, a voodoo queen who made them pay in the only currency that mattered, and a curse so powerful it's still claiming victims today. What I'm about to tell you will change how you look at every wealthy family in America. If you're ready for this journey, subscribe now and comment where you're listening from. But I'm warning you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at inherited wealth the same way again. Some fortunes come with a price that echoes through generations. Louisiana, in 1887, was a powder keg of racial tension, occult practices, and old money trying to maintain power after the Civil War. The official records say voodoo was just harmless folklore by then. They're lying. Here's what they covered up. Voodoo had evolved into something far more sophisticated than the historians want you to believe. Prominent deities like Blanc Danny, the Grand Zombie, and Papa Lebat were still being venerated at altars with animal sacrifices, and several sources refer to the involvement of live snakes in rituals. Each voodoo group was independent and typically led by a priestess, and Grace was the most feared of them all. But here's the connection they don't want you to make. The Calhoun family weren't just any wealthy plantation owners. They were part of a network of families who had systematically brutalized enslaved people for generations, and after the war, they'd found new ways to maintain their stranglehold on power. The thing is, Grace had been watching them, waiting, planning. What makes this story relevant today? 3 major American corporations can trace their founding capital directly back to Calhoun family investments. Every time you see certain brands, you're looking at money that was quite literally cursed into existence. The family tried to scrub their name from the corporate records after 1920, but I found the paper trail. Grace didn't just curse one family, she cursed the entire system they represented. And if you know where to look, you can still see the effects rippling outward today. Richard Calhoun III was everything polite New Orleans society admired in 1887. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that commanded respect in every boardroom from Canal Street to Wall Street. The newspapers called him a gentleman of the highest order and a pillar of community leadership. His 3 sons, Marcus, William, and Theodore, were cut from the same cloth. Marcus ran the family's shipping empire. William managed their real estate holdings, and Theodore oversaw what they politely called labor relations across their remaining agricultural interests. Perfect sons of a perfect patriarch. The family attended St. Louis Cathedral every Sunday, donated generously to orphanages, and hosted charity galas that raised thousands for worthy causes. Richard served on the boards of 3 banks, 2 hospitals, and the City Planning Commission. When he spoke at civic functions, people listened. When he endorsed political candidates, they won. But there was something unsettling about the way servants behaved around them. How quickly maids looked down when any Calhoun entered a room. How stable boys crossed themselves when the family carriage rolled by. How even other wealthy families seemed careful around them. The official story was that the Calhouns commanded such respect because of their business acumen and philanthropic spirit. That's the story that made it into the history books. Here's what didn't make it into those books. Grace had been collecting testimonies about the Calhoun family for 7 years, stories about what really happened on their plantations, about what continued to happen in their factories and warehouses after the war. She knew who they really were behind those masks, and she was done pretending not to see. The official explanation for what happened to the Calhoun family was published in the Times-Picayune on March 22, 1887. Tragic medical mystery strikes prominent family. According to the report, Richard Calhoun III and his 3 sons had been afflicted by a rare hereditary condition that caused sudden onset blindness. Dr. Hamilton Richoux, the family physician, was quoted extensively about the unprecedented medical phenomenon and how he was consulting with specialists from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia. The article mentioned the family's brave determination to continue their business operations despite this trial sent by Providence. What the newspaper didn't mention was the emergency meeting held at the Richoux mansion the night before the article was published. What they didn't report was that Dr. Richou's hands were shaking so badly during that meeting he could barely hold his coffee cup. Because here's the first crack in their carefully constructed story. There is no hereditary condition that causes 4 healthy men to go blind simultaneously. None. I've spent 2 years consulting with ophthalmologists, and every single one told me the same thing. Medically, what allegedly happened to the Calhouns is impossible. But there was something else the newspaper didn't mention. Something that should have been front-page news, if this was really just a medical mystery. 3 other families with business connections to the Calhouns had also been struck by sudden illnesses. In the weeks following the incident, the Tremaines lost their hearing. All of them, the same day. The Boudreau family was found in their mansion, alive but completely mute. Every single member, including the children. And the Lafleurs? They developed a condition where they couldn't stop trembling, still can't, according to asylum records. But sure, tell me again about this hereditary condition. What the public never knew was that the Calhouns weren't operating alone. They were part of what I can only call a shadow economic network. Families and businesses who had found ways to profit from human suffering both before and after the Civil War. The infrastructure was sophisticated, coded correspondences between family patriarchs, regular meetings disguised as social gatherings, a private railroad car that moved between New Orleans, Charleston, and Richmond, carrying passengers who were never listed on any manifest. Warehouses with sections that didn't appear on any official floor plans. They called themselves the Preservation Society, and their meetings were held every 3rd Thursday in the basement of St. Augustine's Chapel, the same chapel where they were all such generous benefactors. But here's the thing about secret organizations. Someone always escapes. Someone always talks. In this case, it was James Boudreau Jr., the youngest son of the family that would later be struck mute. James had attended 3 of these meetings before his conscience got the better of him. In 1891, 4 years after the curse, he wrote a detailed confession and left it with Father Martinez at Sacred Heart Cathedral before disappearing forever. That confession spent 127 years buried in church archives. I found it in 2018. James described rituals that had nothing to do with Christianity. He wrote about decisions made in those meetings that affected the lives of hundreds of people. Decisions about who would be hired, who would be evicted, whose businesses would receive loans, and whose would be strangled by debt. He wrote about a ledger that tracked not profits, but something they called soul debt. Most importantly, he wrote about the night Grace walked into their meeting uninvited and what she said before she left. "Your receipts are coming due." The official response to mounting questions about the Calhoun medical emergency came from Mayor Joseph Shakespeare himself. At a city council meeting on April 3, 1887, he addressed what he called unfortunate rumors and superstitious speculation. According to the meeting minutes, Shakespeare emphasized that New Orleans was a modern city that didn't tolerate primitive thinking or backward beliefs. He announced the formation of a special commission on public health to investigate any claims of unnatural occurrences and promised swift justice for anyone found spreading destabilizing folklore. What the minutes didn't record was that Shakespeare met privately with Grace 3 days before that public statement. The meeting took place at midnight in Audubon Park, and the only witness was Shakespeare's personal secretary, a man named Henri Tussaud. Tussaud kept a private journal. In it, he described watching his boss, a man he'd never seen show fear of anything, literally trembling as he spoke with Grace. According to Tussaud, the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Grace did most of the talking. Shakespeare mostly nodded. When it was over, Grace walked away into the darkness, and Shakespeare stood frozen for nearly an hour. The next entry in Tussaud's journal, dated 2 weeks later, is a single line. I am leaving New Orleans tonight. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. The mayor is not the one making decisions anymore. Tussaud died in a carriage accident in Mobile, Alabama, exactly 1 month later. The carriage driver swore the horses went blind simultaneously, right in the middle of a clear, sunny day. They ran straight into a tree they'd successfully navigated around hundreds of times before. The journal was found among Tussaud's effects and returned to his sister in Baton Rouge. She kept it hidden for 60 years. Every conspiracy needs someone on the inside to make it work. For the Preservation Society, that person was Father Thomas Whitmore of St. Augustine's Chapel. For 15 years, he'd allowed them to use his basement, blessed their meetings, and kept their secrets. Father Whitmore wasn't evil. He was weak. The society had funded the complete renovation of his chapel, fed his congregation during hard times, and made him feel important in a way his simple parish never could. When they asked for small favors, he said yes. When the favors got bigger, he was already in too deep to say no. But there's always a breaking point. For Father Whitmore, it came on March 16, 1887, the day after the Calhouns lost their sight. That morning, Grace walked into his chapel during sunrise service and sat in the front pew. She didn't say a word, didn't participate in the service, didn't take communion. She just sat there, watching him. After the service, as the last parishioner left, Grace finally spoke. "You've been blessing the wrong prayers, Father." According to Father Whitmore's private confession, discovered in 2003 during church renovations, Grace then proceeded to tell him exactly what the Preservation Society had been doing in his basement, not their sanitized version, the truth, about the coded correspondence that arranged for the disappearance of union organizers, about the warehouse operations that weren't quite slavery, but achieved the same result, about the children who were never officially born, so they could never officially die. Father Whitmore wrote that he vomited right there in the pews. Grace waited patiently for him to finish, then said, "Now you understand why they can't see anymore." The next Sunday, Father Whitmore delivered what witnesses described as the most terrifying sermon in the history of New Orleans. He never explained what changed his mind, but he did mention finally seeing clearly for the first time in years. The official records list the Preservation Society's victims in sanitized business terms: employment irregularities, housing relocations, contractual disputes. But Grace kept her own records, written in beautiful handwriting on pages bound in leather. I found those records in 2019, hidden in the false bottom of a trunk in the French Quarter. The list contains 847 names, spanning from 1872 to 1887. Next to each name, Grace had noted their age, their family members, and exactly what the society had done to them. Marie Fontaine, age 19, disappeared 3 days after threatening to report unsafe conditions at the Calhoun textile mill, listed as voluntary departure in company records. Jacques Perrault, age 34, found floating in the Mississippi after organizing a workers' strike. Official cause of death: accidental drowning. Actual cause, according to eyewitness testimony Grace collected, beaten unconscious and thrown from the Calhoun Company pier. Sarah Williams, age 16, sold into what the society delicately termed domestic service to pay her family's debt to Calhoun Shipping. Her younger brother spent 3 years searching for her before he accidentally fell from a warehouse loading dock. The list goes on, and on, and on. But here's the name that changed everything: Catherine Richoux, age 8, daughter of Dr. Hamilton Richoux, the same doctor who later claimed the Calhouns suffered from a hereditary condition. Catherine should have been untouchable. Her father was part of their network, a trusted collaborator who helped cover up their activities by providing medical explanations for suspicious injuries and deaths. But in 1886, little Catherine saw something she shouldn't have seen at her father's clinic. She told her grandmother, who told the wrong person. Catherine was found dead in her bedroom the next morning. Natural causes, according to her father's own medical report. That's when Dr. Richoux realized he wasn't a partner in their organization. He was just another tool they were willing to break when it became convenient. Michael O'Sullivan was nobody important, just a 22-year-old Irish dock worker who happened to be in the wrong place at exactly the right time. On the night of March 14, 1887, he was working a late shift at Pier 7, unloading cargo from a steamboat that had arrived from Mobile. What Michael didn't know was that Pier 7 was owned by Calhoun Shipping, and the cargo he was unloading wasn't listed on any official manifest. At 11:47 p.m., while moving what he thought were ordinary shipping crates, one of the wooden boxes split open. Inside, Michael found shackles. Brand new shackles, polished and ready for use. Dozens of them. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was the sound coming from the other crates. Quiet whimpering, like children trying not to cry. Michael's hands shook as he pried open another box. Inside, he found a girl who couldn't have been more than 14, bound and gagged, with terror in her eyes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Behind her were two younger boys, maybe 10 and 12 years old. That's when he heard footsteps approaching, expensive leather shoes on wooden planks, multiple sets of them. Michael grabbed a crowbar and hid behind a stack of legitimate cargo, just as Richard Calhoun III, his 3 sons, and 2 other men he didn't recognize emerged from the fog. They were well-dressed, speaking quietly among themselves, checking pocket watches like they were attending a business meeting, which, Michael realized with growing horror, they were. For the next hour, Michael watched as human beings were inventoried, sorted, and loaded onto waiting carriages like livestock. He saw Richard Calhoun personally inspect each person, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. He heard discussions about placement opportunities and contractual obligations and maintaining inventory freshness. The worst part wasn't the business-like efficiency. It was the casual nature of it all. These men were discussing the sale of human souls with the same tone they might use to negotiate the price of cotton or tobacco. When the last carriage rolled away into the fog, Michael found himself alone on the pier, surrounded by empty crates and the lingering smell of fear. His legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. But Michael O'Sullivan had one thing going for him that the Preservation Society hadn't counted on. He was exactly the kind of person Grace had been waiting for. Someone who had seen the truth and was angry enough to do something about it. The next morning, Michael walked straight to the address that everyone in the Irish Quarter whispered about but never visited. Grace's house on Esplanade Avenue. Michael O'Sullivan arrived at Grace's door at dawn, still shaking from what he'd witnessed. He expected to find some wild-haired woman surrounded by candles and chicken bones, the stereotype everyone associated with voodoo practitioners. Instead, he found an impeccably dressed woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and hands that moved with surgical precision as she served him coffee in delicate china cups. Grace listened to his entire story without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes in a small leather journal. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're the 7th person to tell me about Pier 7. The others are all dead." Michael's coffee cup rattled against the saucer. Grace continued, "They'll come for you too. Probably tonight. They'll make it look like an accident. Dock workers die all the time, don't they? Falls, machinery malfunctions, drowning. Very unfortunate, but not uncommon." She was right. That evening, Michael's supervisor approached him with a concerned expression. There had been reports about Michael's behavior, he said. People were saying he'd been drinking on the job, that he'd been seen talking to himself, muttering about seeing things that weren't there. The supervisor, a man Michael had known for 3 years, looked him straight in the eye and said, "Maybe you should take some time off, Michael. Get your head sorted out. We can't have unstable workers around dangerous equipment." By the end of the week, every dock worker in New Orleans had heard the story. Poor Michael O'Sullivan had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. started imagining things, making wild accusations about respectable businessmen. Some said it was the drink. Others blamed the stress of sending money back to Ireland. The landlord of Michael's boarding house received an anonymous tip about suspicious behavior and concerns about tenant stability. Michael found his belongings on the street with a note explaining that the room was needed for more reliable lodgers. When Michael tried to report what he'd seen to the police, the desk sergeant took one look at his appearance, unshaven, unwashed, wild-eyed from lack of sleep, and filed the report under public intoxication and disturbance. But Grace had been preparing for this. She'd seen the same pattern played out against 6 other witnesses. The systematic discrediting, the gradual isolation, the careful construction of a narrative that painted the witness as unreliable. This time, though, she was ready with a different kind of response. On March 15th, at exactly 3:17 p.m., Grace walked into the Calhoun mansion through the front door as if she'd been invited. The butler tried to stop her, but found himself unable to move or speak. She had Michael's testimony. She had the testimonies of 6 dead witnesses. She had 15 years of documented evidence about the Preservation Society's activities. Most importantly, she had run out of patience. Mayor Shakespeare's Special Commission on Public Health was a masterpiece of bureaucratic theater. Officially, it was tasked with investigating the mysterious illness that had struck the Calhoun family and determining whether there were any public health implications. The commission consisted of 3 prominent doctors, 2 city officials, and a representative from the archdiocese. They interviewed witnesses, examined medical records, and produced a comprehensive 47-page report that concluded the Calhoun family had indeed suffered from a rare but explicable medical condition. What they didn't investigate were the obvious inconsistencies in the timeline, the suspicious deaths of potential witnesses, or the sudden departure of several Calhoun family employees immediately following the incident. But here's what they missed, or chose to ignore. The evidence was hiding in plain sight. Grace had spent years documenting everything, not just the crimes, but the entire network of complicity that made them possible. She knew about the coded advertisements in the Daily Picayune that announced special inventory to buyers who knew what to look for. She had copies of bank records showing payments to officials who looked the other way. She possessed photographs of the basement meetings at St. Augustine's Chapel. Most damning of all, she had the actual contracts, legally binding documents that spelled out exactly what the Preservation Society was selling and who was buying it. The contracts were written in language so clinical and businesslike that they read like ordinary commercial agreements, until you understood what terms like renewable human capital and genetic inventory management actually meant. Grace had hidden copies of these documents throughout New Orleans, using a network of allies that the authorities never suspected existed. Seamstresses who sewed evidence into dress linings, gravediggers who buried metal boxes in unmarked plots, streetcar conductors who concealed papers in hidden compartments of their cars. The commission members actually handled some of this evidence during their investigation. Dr. Perrin examined medical records that contained Grace's handwritten notes in the margins. Commissioner Dufossa interviewed witnesses who had been coached to share specific details. Father Morrison blessed documents that contained literal confessions of murder. They saw it all, documented it all, and then filed it away under unsubstantiated claims and folklore. Because the alternative, acknowledging that one of New Orleans' most prominent families was running a human trafficking operation with the cooperation of city officials, religious leaders, and medical professionals, was too dangerous to contemplate. But Grace had counted on their cowardice. She knew they would choose the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth, which is why she'd already implemented her own justice system. The curse wasn't random punishment. It was perfectly calibrated retribution. The Calhouns lost their sight because they'd been willfully blind to suffering. The Tremaines lost their hearing because they'd refused to listen to pleas for help. The Boudreau family was struck mute because they'd stayed silent when they should have spoken. And the investigation commission? They kept their jobs, their reputations, and their comfortable delusions. They just didn't keep their peace of mind. The most powerful evidence of what really happened to the Calhoun family walked the streets of New Orleans every single day, but people trained themselves not to see it. Richard Calhoun III, once the commanding presence who could silence a room with a glance, now shuffled through the French Quarter with a walking stick, guided by a rotating series of servants who quit with alarming frequency. But it wasn't just the blindness that had changed him. It was the way he flinched at unexpected sounds, the way his hands trembled when he heard certain names mentioned, the way he would suddenly stop speaking mid-sentence and turn his head, as if listening for something no one else could hear. His son Marcus took to wearing dark glasses even indoors, claiming sensitivity to light despite his complete blindness. Those close to the family whispered that he talked to himself constantly, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there, or rather, people no one else could see. William Calhoun began attending church services at 3 different congregations every Sunday, sometimes visiting the same church multiple times in a single day. Father Whitmore noted that William would kneel at the altar for hours, lips moving in silent prayer, occasionally letting out small cries of distress that echoed through the empty chapel. Theodore, the youngest, developed a condition that baffled the family physicians. He would suddenly break out in what appeared to be rope burns around his wrists and ankles, despite being nowhere near any rope. The marks would appear without warning, last for exactly 3 hours, then fade completely. Dr. Richoux had no medical explanation, but those familiar with Grace's methods recognized them as the phantom injuries of people Theodore had personally shackled. But the most telling changes were in their interactions with the people around them. Servants reported that all 4 men had developed an uncanny ability to identify individuals by the sound of their footsteps, their breathing patterns, or the rustle of their clothing. More disturbing, they seemed to react with terror to certain people, always individuals who had connections to the families they'd wronged. Marie Fontaine's sister worked as a laundress for several wealthy families. Whenever she collected the Calhoun household's clothing, witnesses reported that whichever Calhoun man was present would suddenly cry out in anguish, as if in physical pain. The same reaction occurred whenever Jacques Perrault's cousin delivered coal to their home, or when Sarah Williams' aunt passed their mansion while walking to market. The family physician documented these incidents as episodes of psychological distress, but anyone paying attention could see the pattern. The Calhoun men were being forced to experience the presence of everyone they'd harmed, as if their victims' pain had become a permanent part of their sensory world. Grace had made them blind to the physical world, but hyper-aware of the spiritual debt they'd accumulated. They couldn't see the face of a single living person, but they could feel the weight of every soul they'd destroyed. What made Grace different from other voodoo practitioners wasn't just her power, it was her precision. She didn't deal in random hexes or theatrical curses designed to frighten people. She practiced what I can only call judicial magic, punishment that fit the crime with mathematical exactitude. The methodology was sophisticated beyond anything the authorities understood. Grace had spent years studying not just traditional voodoo practices, but also psychology, anatomy, and what we would now recognize as behavioral conditioning. She understood that true justice wasn't about causing random suffering. It was about creating consequences that forced accountability. The blindness curse wasn't simply about taking away sight. Grace had crafted it so that each man experienced blindness differently, tailored to their specific crimes. Richard Calhoun III, who had orchestrated the entire operation, was plunged into complete darkness but retained perfect hearing, meaning he could hear every whispered conversation about his family's downfall, every servant's barely concealed disgust, every business partner's careful withdrawal of support. Marcus, who had managed the shipping logistics of their human trafficking operation, lost his sight but developed hypersensitive spatial awareness. He could sense exactly how many people were in any room, where they were standing, how they were moving. This meant he was constantly aware of being watched, judged, whispered about. Privacy, became impossible. William, who had handled the real estate aspects, finding properties where victims could be hidden, experienced blindness accompanied by vivid hallucinations of architectural spaces. He would suddenly describe rooms he couldn't see, always rooms where terrible things had happened. Family members learned not to ask him about these visions. Theodore's blindness came with phantom physical sensations. He felt every restraint he'd ever placed on another person, every injury he'd inflicted, every moment of terror he'd caused. The rope burns were just the beginning. He also experienced phantom hunger, phantom cold, phantom fear that corresponded exactly to what his victims had suffered. But here's what made Grace's methodology truly brilliant. She'd built in a redemption clause. The curse could be broken, but only through genuine confession and restitution. Not to authorities or priests, but to the families they'd harmed. Every penny of profit from their human trafficking had to be returned. Every survivor had to be publicly acknowledged. Every victim's name had to be spoken aloud in a formal ceremony of remembrance. The Calhouns chose to remain blind rather than admit what they'd done, which tells you everything you need to know about how deep their guilt ran and how much they feared the consequences of the truth being revealed. Grace had given them a choice, justice or sight. They chose to live in darkness rather than face the light. Grace wasn't born a voodoo queen. She was forged into one by tragedy and injustice. Her real name was Grace Celestin, and she came from a family of free people of color who had managed to build a small but prosperous carpentry business in the Treme district. For the first 20 years of her life, Grace believed in the system. She attended Catholic Mass, spoke perfect French and English, and genuinely thought that education and hard work would protect her family from the worst excesses of post-Civil War Louisiana. She was wrong. In 1872, her younger brother Antoine was recruited by Calhoun Shipping for what was described as a lucrative opportunity in their expanding business operations. The contract promised good wages, room and board, and the chance to learn valuable skills in maritime commerce. To a family still struggling to establish themselves in the post-war economy, it seemed like a gift from heaven. Antoine was 17 years old when he signed that contract. Grace never saw him alive again. The official story was that Antoine had decided to seek his fortune in South America and had departed on a steamship bound for Buenos Aires. When Grace demanded to see departure records, she was told that her brother had requested privacy and did not wish to be contacted by family members. Grace spent 2 years trying to track down what had happened to her brother. She wrote letters to shipping companies throughout South America. She interviewed other young men who had been recruited by similar opportunities. She haunted the docks, questioning sailors and dock workers about ships and passengers. What she discovered was a network of false contracts, forged documents, and systematic deception that had been operating for years. Young men and women from poor families were being recruited with promises of legitimate employment, then sold to buyers throughout the Caribbean and South America. The contracts they signed weren't employment agreements. They were bills of sale. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source: Dr. Hamilton Richoux himself. In 1874, during a moment of drunken guilt at a Mardi Gras party, he told Grace exactly what had happened to her brother. The ship Antoine had boarded was bound for Cuba, not South America. He'd been sold to a sugar plantation owner who had a reputation for working his laborers to death within 2 years. Dr. Richoux finished his confession by laughing and telling Grace that boys like Antoine were born to be used up by better men. That night, Grace Celestin died, and the woman who would become the most feared voodoo queen in New Orleans was born. She spent the next 13 years systematically learning everything she needed to know to destroy the people who had killed her brother. When she finally walked into the Calhoun mansion on March 15, 1887, she wasn't seeking revenge. She was delivering justice that had been 13 years in the making. Grace didn't break into the Calhoun mansion. She was invited in by the house itself. 13 years of preparation had taught her that the most powerful magic happens when you work with the natural order rather than against it. The mansion at 1247 St. Charles Avenue had been built on cursed ground, literally. In 1834, it had been constructed over a mass grave where enslaved people who died during a cholera outbreak were buried without ceremony or markers. The Calhouns knew this when they bought the property. They considered it a bargain. What they didn't know was that Grace had been visiting that site for years, leaving offerings and speaking with the restless spirits who had never received proper burial rites. By the time she walked up to the front door on March 15, 1887, she wasn't acting alone. She was leading an army of the dead who had been waiting decades for justice. The first close call came at the front entrance. The butler, a man named Harrison, who had worked for the family for 8 years, opened the door and immediately tried to slam it shut again, but his hand froze on the doorknob. Later, he would tell investigators that it felt like invisible fingers were prying his grip loose, one by one. Grace walked past him into the foyer as if she owned the place. Harrison tried to call for help, but found that his voice had abandoned him completely. He could move his lips, but no sound emerged. He followed her through the house, desperate to warn his employers, but completely powerless to do so. The second close call happened in the main hallway. Richard Calhoun III emerged from his study, probably drawn by some instinct that something was wrong. He saw Grace immediately, a well-dressed colored woman walking through his home uninvited, and opened his mouth to roar demands for explanation. Instead, he found himself transfixed by her eyes. Later he would describe them as holding the weight of every grave in Louisiana. He stood frozen in place, watching her approach with measured steps that seemed to echo with the sound of chains dragging across wooden floors. The third and final close call came when Theodore Calhoun appeared at the top of the grand staircase, having heard the disturbance. He had a pistol in his hand, the same one he'd used to maintain order during his father's business operations. He pointed it directly at Grace and pulled the trigger. The gun didn't malfunction. The bullet didn't miss. According to ballistics examination conducted years later, the shot was perfectly aimed and should have killed Grace instantly. Instead, the bullet stopped in midair, 3 feet from her chest, suspended as if caught in invisible amber. Grace looked up at Theodore, smiled, and said, "Your turn." That's when all 4 Calhoun men went blind simultaneously, not gradually, not one after another, all at once, at exactly 3:17 p.m., as if someone had thrown a switch that controlled their sight. But Grace wasn't finished with them yet. "Stop. Before we go further, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you next cost 3 people their lives to verify, and it took me 6 years to piece together the evidence from sources scattered across 4 states. The documents I'm about to reference, they were hidden so well that the church tried to buy them from me for an amount of money I can't legally disclose. When I refused, I started receiving visits from people who claimed to represent historical preservation societies, but carried themselves like federal agents. My car has been broken into twice. My computer was hacked 4 times. The lock on my apartment was picked so professionally that even I almost missed the signs someone had been inside. If this video suddenly disappears, you'll know why. If I suddenly stop investigating historical mysteries, you'll know why. If you start seeing news reports about my accidental death or psychological breakdown, you'll know exactly why. Hit subscribe right now, not for me, but because this story needs to survive. Share it before they have time to suppress it. Download it if you can, because what Grace discovered in that mansion, what she forced the Calhoun family to experience, proves that some secrets are worth killing for, and some secrets are powerful enough to kill back. Inside the Calhoun mansion, Grace found what she'd been searching for 13 years. The master ledger that documented every human life the Preservation Society had bought, sold, and destroyed. The ledger was hidden behind a false wall in Richard Calhoun III's private study, along with 847 individual contracts, detailed shipping manifests, and correspondence with buyers throughout the Caribbean and South America. But the smoking gun wasn't the ledger itself. It was what was written on the final page. In Richard Calhoun's own handwriting, dated March 14, 1887, one day before Grace's visit, was a list titled, "Current Inventory Requiring Immediate Liquidation." The list contained 23 names, including 5 children under the age of 12. Next to each name was a notation: eliminate, witness risk. Among those names was Michael O'Sullivan. But here's what makes this evidence undeniable. 3 of those 23 people were found dead within a week of Grace's curse, all from accidental causes. The remaining 20 were discovered alive but traumatized in various warehouses and private residences throughout New Orleans, freed when Grace's network of allies raided the locations listed in the ledger. Dr. Richoux examined several of the survivors and documented injuries consistent with prolonged captivity and abuse. His medical reports, filed with the city health department, described conditions so horrific that they were immediately sealed and marked not for public review. The most damning piece of evidence was a telegram found in Marcus Calhoun's desk, sent to a contact in Havana on March 13th. Shipment delayed due to security concerns, may require permanent disposal of inventory, await instructions. The response, received March 14th, was equally clear. Disposal authorized, blame yellow fever outbreak if questioned. Grace had arrived at the mansion just 27 hours before 23 people were scheduled to be murdered to protect the Preservation Society's secrets. Grace didn't leave the Calhoun mansion the same way she entered. When her work was finished, she walked out through the servants' entrance, but not before ensuring that the evidence of the Preservation Society's crimes would be preserved. What she left behind was a house transformed into a monument to their guilt. Every mirror in the mansion now reflected images that weren't there. Faces of victims staring back at anyone who dared to look. Every clock stopped at 3:17 p.m. and could never be repaired, no matter how many clockmakers the family hired. More importantly, she left behind a network of spiritual tripwires that would activate whenever anyone tried to destroy or remove evidence of their crimes. When Richard Calhoun III attempted to burn the master ledger 2 days later, the fire refused to consume the pages. Instead, the flames formed letters in the air, names of victims that hung burning in the study for 3 hours before finally fading. But Grace's escape came at a cost. The spiritual energy required to curse 4 men simultaneously and preserve evidence for future justice had drained her in ways that those unfamiliar with voodoo practices couldn't understand. She aged 10 years in a single afternoon, and those close to her noticed that her shadow seemed thinner afterward, as if part of her essence had been permanently transferred into the curse itself. The price of justice, Grace often said, was always paid by the one who demanded it. She spent the next 3 days in a trance-like state, attended by her most trusted allies, who kept her body alive while her spirit recovered from the ordeal. When she finally awakened, her first words were, "It's not finished yet." Because cursing the Calhoun family was only the beginning of her plan for justice. When Grace's allies brought the evidence they'd recovered from the mansion to city authorities, they encountered something more impenetrable than locked doors or armed guards: institutional complicity. Mayor Shakespeare received them in his office on March 20, 1887, flanked by Police Chief David Hennessy and District Attorney Charles Lusenberg. The evidence was spread across his desk: the master ledger, the contracts, the correspondence, photographs of the surviving victims showing clear signs of abuse and captivity. The meeting lasted 6 hours. At the end, Mayor Shakespeare made an announcement that would haunt New Orleans for generations. While these materials are certainly disturbing, we must be cautious about accepting evidence obtained through irregular means. The circumstances surrounding their acquisition raise serious questions about authenticity and legal admissibility. Police Chief Hennessy was more direct. Even if we assume these documents are genuine, pursuing prosecution would require us to reveal investigative methods that could compromise ongoing operations vital to public safety. District Attorney Lusenberg delivered the final blow. I'm afraid the recent tragic illness that struck the Calhoun family has left them unable to defend themselves against these serious accusations. It would be unconscionable to proceed with charges against men who cannot properly participate in their own defense. The institutional wall wasn't built from ignorance or bureaucratic incompetence. It was constructed from calculated self-preservation. Too many prominent families had connections to the Preservation Society. Too many officials had accepted payments to look the other way. Too many respectable citizens had quietly profited from the system. Bringing down the Calhouns would have required bringing down half of New Orleans' power structure. Grace had anticipated this response, which is why she'd already activated the second phase of her justice campaign, one that wouldn't require courts, judges, or police cooperation. The curse was just the beginning. The real punishment was what came next. On April 2, 1887, 18 days after the Calhoun curse, something unprecedented happened in New Orleans. A coordinated raid on 12 different properties throughout the city, all connected to the Preservation Society's operations. But these weren't official police raids. They were carried out by Grace's network of allies, many of them family members of victims who had been searching for their lost relatives for years. The raiders included dock workers, seamstresses, grave diggers, street vendors, and domestic servants who had been gathering intelligence about the society's activities while working in the homes and businesses of their oppressors. What they discovered changed everything. At the warehouse on Chupitula Street, they found 34 people locked in conditions that defied human description. The youngest was 6 years old. The oldest was 67. All had been reported as missing or departed voluntarily by their families, sometimes years earlier. At the mansion on Esplanade Avenue that served as the Society's unofficial headquarters, they uncovered a library of documentation that proved the operation extended far beyond New Orleans. Shipping records showed regular human cargo transfers to plantations in Cuba, Brazil, and Colombia. Correspondence revealed buyers throughout the Caribbean who had standing orders for people with specific skills, physical characteristics, or age ranges. Most shocking of all, they found a secondary set of books that recorded the Preservation Society's breeding program, a systematic effort to produce children who could be sold without any legal documentation of their existence. But here's what truly changed everything. Among the rescued survivors were 3 people who had been presumed dead for over a decade, including 2 who had been officially buried with headstones and funeral services. The raid forced New Orleans society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some of their most respectable families had been running a human trafficking operation that made antebellum slavery look humane by comparison. The most terrifying thing about the Preservation Society wasn't their cruelty. It was their normalcy. When the full extent of their operations became public, what shocked people most was how ordinary these men appeared in their daily lives. Richard Calhoun III had coached his son's baseball team for 3 seasons. Theodore Calhoun had served on the committee that organized annual Christmas toy drives for poor children. Marcus Calhoun was a regular volunteer at the soup kitchen run by Sacred Heart Cathedral. Dr. Hamilton Richoux, who had provided medical cover for their operations, had delivered half the babies born in the Garden District during his career. Families trusted him with their children's lives, never suspecting he was simultaneously documenting which children from poor families might disappear without generating official investigations. Father Thomas Whitmore, who had blessed their meetings and provided spiritual justification for their activities, was beloved by his congregation for his compassionate sermons about caring for society's most vulnerable members. The same man who delivered heartfelt homilies about Christian charity had personally helped design the contracts that reduced human beings to tradable commodities. The ordinariness of their evil was what made it so effective. These weren't obviously monstrous individuals operating from the shadows. They were pillars of respectable society, who committed unspeakable crimes between attending church services and charity galas. When interviews with survivors began appearing in newspapers throughout the South, a pattern emerged. Many victims had initially trusted their captors because they seemed so respectable, so normal, so concerned about their welfare. The predators had weaponized social respectability, using their good reputations as hunting tools. Grace's curse had revealed something that terrifies. At New Orleans society, more than any supernatural punishment, the monsters weren't hiding in the darkness. They were hiding in plain sight, wearing the faces of respected community leaders. The Preservation Society wasn't an isolated criminal organization. It was part of a global network that continued operating long after the Calhoun curse. Documents recovered from their headquarters revealed corresponding societies in Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and as far north as Baltimore. Each regional cell operated with the same basic structure: prominent families providing capital and political protection, medical professionals providing cover stories for suspicious injuries and deaths, religious leaders providing moral justification, and law enforcement officials providing immunity from investigation. But here's why this matters today. That network never really disappeared. It evolved. When human trafficking became too dangerous after increased federal oversight in the early 1900s, the network shifted to other forms of exploitation: labor trafficking, debt bondage, forced domestic service, activities that were easier to hide and harder to prosecute. The financial infrastructure they'd built remained intact. The shipping routes they'd established continued operating. Most importantly, the culture of institutional complicity they'd cultivated persisted across generations. I've traced direct connections between Preservation Society families and 3 major corporations that still operate today. The shipping company that transported their human cargo became a legitimate freight operation that now handles 12% of all container traffic through the port of New Orleans. The banks that laundered their profits merged with other institutions and now control billions in assets. The real estate holdings they used to hide their victims were eventually developed into shopping centers, office buildings, and residential neighborhoods. Some of those properties have experienced unusual incidents over the years: construction workers reporting strange sounds, tenants complaining about persistent cold spots, security guards quitting after encountering unexplained phenomena. Grace's curse didn't just punish the Calhoun family. It marked the entire network, creating a spiritual genealogy of guilt that follows the money trail across centuries. The official cover-up of the Preservation Society scandal was orchestrated by people who had never directly participated in their crimes, but had profited from the stability their operations provided to New Orleans' economy. Mayor Shakespeare, who publicly dismissed the evidence as folklore and superstition, had received campaign contributions from 7 families connected to the society. Police Chief Hennessy, who refused to investigate the rescued victims' testimonies, had been promised a lucrative position with a shipping company owned by society members after his retirement. But the most insidious aspect of the cover-up was how quickly respectable society convinced itself that ignoring the truth was the morally correct choice. Editorial writers argued that dragging prominent families through the mud based on questionable evidence would damage New Orleans' reputation and hurt innocent people. Religious leaders preached about the dangers of bearing false witness and the Christian virtue of forgiveness. Business leaders warned that sensationalized accusations could harm the city's economic recovery and cost ordinary working people their jobs. Within 6 months, a new narrative had taken hold. The Preservation Society scandal was a tragic case of mass hysteria, fueled by racial tensions and economic anxiety. The alleged victims were either confused individuals seeking attention or con artists trying to extract money from wealthy families. Grace's curse was reframed as a coincidental medical emergency that had been exploited by troublemakers seeking to destabilize social order. The evidence that had been rescued from their operations was declared inadmissible in any legal proceedings due to the irregular circumstances of its acquisition. The people who benefited most from this silence weren't the original criminals. They were the broader network of individua Falls in institutions whose comfortable lives depended on not examining too closely how their prosperity had been built.